Hi guys, moving on to adding and subtracting fractions. We're going to have a brief look at some common multiples and equivalent fractions, and then we'll move straight into the content. A lot of the skills you've learned previously will be transferable. I'll also give you a brief description of some of the cursors that I'm going to be using to highlight the key points. Okay, like I said, just a wee look at what I'm going to be using to explain some of the notes here. I'll start off with this red box here. I may just move the red box to let you see the portions of the note that I want you to particularly focus on as I'm talking through it. I may also use this laser point here, which highlights in red. It's a little bit harder to follow, and it's likely that I'll move it quite quickly. So it'll be a mixture of the two, and hopefully it'll make a whole lot of sense once we start. And you just let me know online if there's something that you think is not working. Okay, so looking at the fractions, just a quick recap of the basics. So the top number of a fraction, in this case, the 2 that you'll see is highlighted in red. That's obviously the numerator, and the bottom number, the 5, is the denominator. Now, what we need to know for certain, when adding and subtracting fractions, we must have a common denominator, or in other words, the denominator must be the same value. Okay, so on top of that, to find a common denominator, what we need to do is we need to find the lowest common multiple between any pairs of denominators. And I'll go into more detail on that when we go into the next slide. But I thought we would have a wee look at the list of multiples 2 and 4, just to see the difference between a common multiple and the lowest common multiple. Okay, what you'll see is that you've got the multiples of 2, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and 14, and some of the multiples of 4, 4, 8, 12, and so on. And primarily all I quickly want to show you here is that we have a common multiple of 4 that sits on both lists, okay? But equally, the multiple 8 and the multiple 12 are on both lists. Now, if we were going to choose the easiest one to deal with, then we would look for the lowest common multiple. In this case, that would be 4. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to practically going through the questions, it's not always the easiest route to find the lowest common multiple. But we need to be familiar with those phrases. And as long as we've got common multiples in our head, which are going to help us get the common denominator, then we should be in a pretty good position to be able to move forward with this type of problem. Okay, guys, just a quick recap on equivalent fractions or equal fractions. The easiest way to deal with equal fractions or to create equal fractions is to just take the top and bottom number and multiply them by the same number. So we're going to pick the number 5. So if we multiply 3 by 5 and 5 by 5, we will then create an equal and equivalent fraction. Okay, it's important that we realize it's not the number 5 that's important. It can be any number. You could choose 4, you could choose 3, you could choose 2. And I'll show you that right now. So if I take the number 3 and I decide to multiply it by 5, then that would give me 15. Okay, now because I've multiplied the 3 by 5, I have to multiply the bottom by the same number, and that's the most important thing. You multiply the top and bottom by the same number. If we multiply that by 5, then we end up with 5 times 5, which is 25. So an equivalent fraction of 3 over 5 is 15 over 25. Now, if I decided to take any other fraction, say 2 over 7, and the easiest number to create an equivalent fraction with is just to multiply everything by 2. So 2 times 2 would be 4. Because I've multiplied the top by 2, I must multiply the bottom by 2. So 7 times 2 is 14. So 2/7 is the same as 4 over 14. Okay, now into the main body of the lesson. We've got adding and subtracting fractions. Hopefully you've been taking your notes and you've got the whole heading as fractions, and this portion is adding and subtracting. So I would advise that you have a subheading, adding and subtracting. And the key point that I'm going to labour on is that when we're adding and subtracting fraction, the denominator must be the same, as you can see here. Okay, so we must have the same denominator in both fractions. Okay, so I'll bring your attention to question 1. Okay, question 1. 1/3 plus 2/5. Two fractions with different denominators. We need to create the same denominator on both fractions. Okay, now the easiest way, and I mentioned common multiples that we've used previously. Now the easiest thing to do here, we need a common multiple, and preferably the lowest common multiple. But the quickest way, and it's a small cheat to find a common multiple, is you take those two bottom numbers, so in this case the 3 and the 5, and you multiply them together. Okay, so 3 times 5 is 15. Now I like to set up the denominators first. So the 15 we know is what we want as our common denominator, and we've got that from doing 3 times 5. That makes life a little bit easier, quite simply because we know where we want to end up, and it allows us to see quite clearly what steps we've taken to change the 3 and the 5 into 15. So in the first instance, what I've done is I've taken the 3 and I've changed that to 15. Okay, now the other way we can change the 3 to 15 is if we multiply it by 5. Okay, and likewise, I've taken the 5 and I've changed it to 15. And to do that, we multiplied by 3. And this is important just from your equivalent fractions. If we make these steps and we multiply the bottom number by any given number, we must multiply the top number by that same number. So we stick with the red arrows. Number 3, we multiplied by 5. So we now have to multiply the 1 by 5. So 1 times 5 gives us 5 in here. Okay, and the green was 5 times 3 to give us 15. So we have to do the same to the 2. This time is 2 times 3, and that will give us our 6. And what we end up with there is we end up with equivalent fractions with the same denominator, 5 over 15 plus 6 over 15. So 5 over 15 plus 6 over 15. And we just add them like we would do normally, 11 over 15. Okay, example 2. As you can see here, we've got 2/3 plus 3/4, and 3 and 4 as our denominator, so we need a common denominator. Like I've said previously, the quickest way to create the common denominator is just to take the two numbers at the bottom and multiply them together. So 3 times 4 is 12, and therefore we set up the fractions with our two denominators in already to help us follow what's going to happen at each fraction to change it to the equivalent fraction. So if we start with the 2/3, then to change from a 3 to a 12, we multiply it by 4, and therefore we must do the same to the top. 2 times 4 will give us 8. So we end up with 8 over 12. So the equivalent fraction of 2/3 is 8 over 12. Now if we take the right hand side and we say we've now changed the 4 to a 12, so 4 times 3 gives us 12. So we must do the same with this one. 3 multiplied by 3, because we have to times the top and bottom by the same number. 3 times 3 is 9. Okay, now what we end up with there is we end up with 8 plus 9 is 17. 17 over 12. And you'll recognize from the stuff you've done previously that that's an improper fraction or a top-heavy fraction. So to make that, I'll change that back into a mixed number. We did 17 divided by 12 is 1. That gives us our whole number. We have a remainder of 5. We don't write remainder like you would have done in primary school. We just put that over the existing denominator. So 1 and 5/12 is our final answer. Okay, now let's have a look at subtraction. Okay, the process for subtraction is entirely the same. Hopefully you're starting to get the gist of how to create the common denominator. So we've got 7 and 9 as our denominators currently. So 7 times 9 is 63. So that creates our denominators. We know we're going to need to change these to 63. Okay, now remember, it's important to notice in this question we're dealing with a subtraction. So the sign in the middle has to be a takeaway. Okay, so just like before, if we take our left-hand side in the reds, what did we do to the 7? To change it to 63, we multiplied by 9. Okay, so the same has to happen on the top. If we multiply by 9 on the bottom, we must multiply by 9 on the top. So 4 times 9 is 36. Okay, same, repeat the process for 9. 9 times what gives us 63? We had to multiply it by 7. So the same has to happen with the 2. Okay, 2 times 7 is 14. Forgive me, 7 up here. So we've done our multiplications, we've got our fractions like we would have done before, but this time it's a takeaway. So 36 take away 14 is just 22, 22 over 63. And that's us done. Process hasn't changed. We're just doing a subtraction. We still create our common denominator. And then once we've got the common denominator, we can add and subtract like we have always done.